私はモダンな町娘ちょいと散歩に入るく粋なその後と手を組んでララ歌うた甘いラブソング
ご機嫌いかがですか？渡辺Danです。Today on Japanese Movies You've Never Seen, I want to talk about a genre that you probably didn't even know exists, and that is the genre of the Japanese film musical. No, it's not a genre that has had a lot of exposure in the West. And yes, most of the movies that are in the genre are, shall we say, a little bit embarrassing. But it is still one that I think is worth exploring. This particular song in this movie, it shows that even in a low-budget Japanese film musical, the most superficial of genres, there could still be an element of social criticism and social commentary, very much like the Busby Berkeley musicals of the 1930s. The song that they are singing here is called Jusen, which used to be 1/10 of a yen, if you can believe that, because yen are now, oh, you drop it on the sidewalk, it's worth less than a penny. But this song, they compare the difference between what you could buy with Jusen back in the old days versus what it buys right now. Note that there is a lot of social commentary there. The movie that we're going to speak about as our exemplar film is a movie called Carmen Comes Home, Karumen Kokyou ni Kairu. And it was directed by the famous director Kinoshita Keisuke, who happens to be my favorite director of all Japanese film directors. Now, I know that you're probably saying, I never heard of Kinoshita Keisuke. Well, that's because most of his movies were never released in the United States. He had kind of a very populist, very romantic style, very light comedy. Sort of like, if you wanted to use an old Hollywood type, it'd be like Leo McCarey or Preston Sturges. He had a sense of the common people. But like many Japanese directors, he would also direct things from a variety of different genres. In fact, his very versatility is what makes him a fascinating director today. I mean, he would go from directing something as heartbreaking as Nihon no Higeki, Tragedy of Japan, about a woman who sacrifices everything for her kids and all they care about is the material progress of the world after World War II, so she has no choice but to throw herself in front of a train, to a horror story like Yotsuya Kaidan, which is actually a story that for a long time was literally remade every year and even now gets remade constantly as a TV movie. It's the kind of the prototype of all J-horror that we see in things like Kaidan and The Ring and things like that. And Kinoshita brought a humanism to it that was very unusual for any adaptation of that story. In fact, he downplayed the ghostly elements of it to upplay the more tragic parts of the scenario. Unfortunately, this version is not available in the US in any English-friendly version that I know of. Carmen Kokyou ni Kairu is a social criticism movie that's also done in the form of a comedy. Historically speaking, it was very important because it was Japan's first color film, and as such, it had a lot of technical difficulties with getting the colors correct, to the point where the clips that we're going to see here are from a very, very, very restored version. And I have a version that I recorded on Japanese TV back in the 80s, and trust me, the colors don't look anything like this. The mountains are the wrong color, in fact. But it's very important because it shows that even for the first Japanese color movie ever, it still had a lot of an understanding of how color can work. Ironically, it was shot in a black and white version at the same time. And this black and white version was actually preferred by Kinoshita and Takamine Hideko, who was his lead. And I don't understand it because even though the performances might be a little bit better, the loss of color is very telling. I have a sneaky suspicion that the reason they did that is the color process was so expensive and Japan was so new to having any kind of economic viability when this movie was made that perhaps they had to say that in order for people not to feel bad that the only version of the film that came to their town happened to be the black and white one. The big formal difference between the two is that the black and white version has things like dissolves and fades and wipes and the things that are missing in the color version, probably because they didn't have the technology to do it, because this was still in the 3-strip color days. The story of Karumen故郷に帰る is about a girl who, after the war, has gone to the big city and has tried her hand at being a famous performer and an actress, and kind of following along the footsteps that Takamine Hideko herself followed in real life. And she's coming back to her small town to visit her parents, and she has become absolutely 100% westernized. She wears Western style clothes. She's always talking about things in Western culture. She sings about Marlene Dietrich. And other things that are very, very not common in traditional Japan. Her father, at one point, even says, well, once upon a time, she was climbing up a tree and she fell and she hit her head, and that's why she's so eccentric. She comes to town with her friend Akemi, and it doesn't take long for everyone to realize that she has indeed achieved a certain amount of notoriety in the Western Tokyo and the very westernized Tokyo of the post-war era. She has become an exotic dancer or a stripper, and she is foolish enough to think that her stripping, rather than being a humiliation, is actually an explication of her art. So naturally, the people in this small town are downright scandalized by her return and her friend Akemi. But we also note that, men being men, that Akemi finds herself a boyfriend, and that Carmen finds that the people who used to know her still like her. They don't quite approve of who she is, but they remember her as she was, as a farm girl. Now, to add to the complexity of this, the school is having financial issues, and the blind pianist, who was blinded during the war, so please don't think that this comedy doesn't have those intrusions of bitter reality. So he needs a new organ, but the town obviously doesn't have enough money to pay for it. So Carmen and Akemi decide that they're going to put on a show, and they're going to show the townspeople. Now, on the one hand, you see the townspeople faced with a moral dilemma. They don't approve of her, especially because she's going to perhaps be prancing around naked. But at the same time, the men secretly want to see it. They want to be scandalized, so to speak. And her father, in a moment of surprising emotion, shows that he's humiliated and he's sorry and he's ashamed.
まともの亭主も持たないで、いくら芸術だか文化になってくれたって、わしが嬉しいはずだっていいじゃありませんか。憎いと思ったり、可愛いと思ったり、口じゃ怒ってても心配で心配で、何年かぶりで帰ってくるといや会いたいに決まってるだが、会って何もかも分かる時がおっかなくて会いたくなかっただ。それがもう帰ってきちゃった。もう仕方がねえだ。なあ校長さん、踊りたいってもんなら踊らせてやろうじゃありませんか。笑い物になるならなったって構いません。どうせ産んだのが親の不運でさ。この木の下で牛に蹴っ飛ばされたのがあいつの不運です。 わしも一緒に笑われました。
But his friends tell him, no, no, no. Lily is doing what she's going to help the town. She's actually quite a heroine. At the end of the movie, everyone wins, but that victory isn't necessarily a completely solid one. Yes, the town now has money for the organ, so that's a happy ending. And Lily and Akemi realize that they're going to go back to the city because as much fun as it was to visit the town, they are now city girls. And so unlike an American movie where you would have everyone hugging and embracing and realize that we can all get along, there's an understanding here that Lily, more likely than not, will probably not be coming back to the town, and it's okay. She has her own life, she has her own path. The town will more or less forget that she was there. They'll appreciate the fact that she donated the organ, but they will go on with their small town life. There is no resolution to this complicated problem. The fact is, Japan, as exemplified by this movie, is having to face a very difficult decision. Do they join the West? Do they keep the traditions? And the answer is, there is no answer. Some will become westernized, some won't. And that's just the way life is. As is common in most Japanese movies, the real moral is mono no aware. You're aware of the bittersweetness of life. For me, Kinoshita Keisuke is the one director that if you need to seek out, even if it's a little bit of a struggle to find his films, it's well worth doing.